Thank you. I appreciate you coming here and helping me with this. And I promise you all that there's a happy ending to my rant. So just stay with me here, okay? I want to talk about what's going on within our administration, which is called shock doctrines. I believe that most of you understand what a shock doctrine is. And just in case, it's this brutal tactic of systematically using the public's disorientation that follows a collective shock, whether it's market crashes, terrorist attacks, war, etc. And this is to ram through radical corporate agendas. And people have been observing Drumpf, and I apologize to those, but I cannot say his name, so I will be using Drumpf throughout my rant. His shock tactics actually are following a script. And this script attempts this rapid change that's imposed under the cover of a crisis. And what we've come to find is that people can't be expected to act in their own best interests when they are so disoriented that they don't know or even no longer care what those interests might be. And from the evidence so far, it's clear that Trump and his top advisors are trying to pull off a domestic shock doctrine. And that goal is an all-out war on the public sphere and the public interest. We got to understand that what's happening in Washington isn't the usual passing of the baton between parties. It's literally a naked corporate takeover, and it's one that's decades in the making. So Trump is not the start of this, but he's the end result. So this is Trump's economic political projects currently. Deconstruction of the regulatory state. A full-bore attack on the welfare state and social services, unleashing this domestic fossil fuel frenzy, and a civilization war against immigrants and radical Islamic terrorism. And believe you me, there are deep, covert implications with all of these. So most of us fully get that Trump is this hollow, media-created, manufactured brand. I mean, that's what all brands are. They're just image. But the reality is that he is now scored the ultimate branding tool, the U.S. presidency. And our U.S. government is now a for-profit family business. I mean, Mar-a-Lago, for Christ's sake. And this all points to a very difficult truth. With every alleged ethics violation, every brazen lie, every deranged tweet, this administration is leaving the public sphere more broken and degraded. I mean, even if the corruption or the treason costs Trump the White House, what's going to be left behind is going to be wreckage. Another truth is that Trump's political career would have been impossible without the deliberate degradation of the whole idea of the public sphere, which has been unfolding for decades. Reagan is responsible for much of that. He famously hailed, "Government's not the solution, it's the problem." So what followed was decades of deregulation that essentially legalized bribery, with these outrageous sums of money flowing into politics. Now, it's absolutely true that this system is corrupt, and people know it. Small groups of corporate interests and the 1% are favored. And it's a bipartisan process. I mean, Bill Clinton deregulated the banks, which set the stage for the 2008 collapse. Obama chose not to prosecute the bankers. And Hillary Clinton almost surely would have done no different. I'd love to think different, but I don't believe so. So, most people are very happy to treat the electoral politics as some kind of morbid entertainment, taking it all in like it's some sort of Saturday Night Live skit. I mean, we've all become like these extras. in Trump's for-profit reality TV show, which has now swallowed the most powerful government in the world. Well, it's time to jam that Trump brand. And we've been doing it, by golly. We identify the big, bold idea behind some companies selling, and then we expose that dirty reality behind the shine. I mean, Bill O'Reilly is an example of a really successful jam. You probably heard of, there's a racial justice organization called Color of Change. Well, they, along with several women's groups, took this backdoor approach. They went after the advertisers. The advertisers were accused of being accomplices to what seemed like this long-term strategy to silence women. And it worked. So any brand can be jammed, even as one as defiantly amoral as Drumpf's. We just need to understand what those weak points are. So, since his personal brand is like being the boss, one way to make him look like, one way to really knock him down is to make him look like a puppet. I mean, we actually saw how quickly Bannon was taken out of the spotlight, didn't we? So, we know that there's been this rise of hollow brands over the last few decades, and most of us, yeah, we get sucked into buying them. I mean, I personally am a J. Crew junkie, but I only buy on sale. Okay, so at the heart of all of this over-consuming hollowness, that's this very powerful force that we have, well, we have this equally, if not more so, powerful force, and it's called human longing for community and connection. And that simply refuses to die. So I'd like to segue briefly to talk about neoliberalism. I mean, it's really an extreme form of capitalism that became dominant in the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher. But it's been the reigning ideology of the world's elites, regardless of affiliation. But it started, I'll let you take a guess. Yeah, on the U.S. right. Neoliberalism is actually basically just the shorthand for an economic project that does basically this. They vilify the public sphere. They vilify anything that's not the workings of the market or the decisions of the individual consumers. So under the neoliberal worldview, governments only exist to create the optimal conditions for private interests to maximize their profits and their wealth. And then they created this myth that profits and economic growth are going to trickle down and help all the rest of the 99%, which invariably fails. It doesn't work. I mean, don't get me wrong, neoliberalism is a very profitable set of ideas for the 1%. But what it really is, at its core, is a rationale for greed. Truth. Our modern capitalist economy was born thanks to two very large subsidiaries. One, stolen indigenous land. Two, stolen African people. And here's another really big fat truth. Nothing has done more to help our present corporate dystopia than this persistent and systematic pitting of working class whites against blacks, citizens against migrants, and men against women. White supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia have been the elite's most potent defenses against genuine democracy. After the Holocaust, our world came together, and we tried to create conditions that would help prevent genocide, this horrible genocidal logic from ever taking hold again. But All of that has been discarded. And we're allowing conditions eerily similar to those 1930s to be recreated today. There's an author by the name of Michelle Alexander. She authored The New Jim Crow. She stated, if progressives think that they can win in the long run without engaging meaningfully with black folks and taking racial history more seriously, well, then they better get Elon Musk on speed dial and start planning their future on Mars, because this planet will be going up in smoke. And while we're on the topic of smoke, Drumpf. He's a master of chaos. Leading figures in the military and in the intelligence communities and the foreign policy establishment, they argue that any perception that the U.S. is at war with Islam as a faith and Muslims as a group is literally a gift to the extremists, because they're looking to how to rationalize bloody attacks on American soldiers and civilians. And Drumpf's actions, his words, his frickin' little Twitter fingers, they add credibility to the jihadist narrative of a civilizational war. Already, ISIS reportedly described Trump's first anti-Muslim travel executive order as a blessed ban that's going to help recruit fighters. Iran's foreign minister warned the ban was a gift to the extremists. So we see that this Drumpf seems determined to do everything possible to reinforce the holy war message. And this idea that we're hearing, that he doesn't realize how provocative he's being, I mean, that rings about as hollow as these claims of his, that he's unaware that his racist rhetoric has generated this climate that's ripe for hate crimes. I mean, the most lethal way that governments overreact to terrorist attacks is by exploiting the atmosphere of fear and to embark on a full-blown foreign war. And as we know, under George E.W., it doesn't necessarily matter if the target has no connection to the original attacks. Iraq wasn't responsible for 9/11, but by gosh, we invaded it anyway. So not only that, but Drumpf has surrounded himself with these masters of chaos, from Tillerson to Mnuchin. I mean, Mnuchin became wealthy off of the housing crisis. Oh, and Tillerson's coup? Well, I mean, chaos has a long track record of sending oil prices up, which is going to then create the fossil fuel frenzy for these high-risk, high-carbon fuel extractions, which are going to rob us of our last chance of averting catastrophic climate change. So in a very real sense, preventing war and averting climate chaos are one and the same. Now, this administration is fully cognizant of the fact that this frenzy of financial deregulations, they're going to make other kinds of shocks and disasters more likely. I'll bet Betsy DeVos is having holy orgasms, you know, from her fantasies of replacing public schools with vouchers and charters if the public is convinced that we're in this financial Armageddon. I mean, literally in the early days of the administration, Mike Pence met with the Wisconsin governor to hear how the governor managed to strip public sector unions of their right to collective bargaining. I'll give you a hint. He used the cover of the state's fiscal crisis. That actually prompted New York Times columnist Paul Krugman to declare that in Wisconsin, the shock doctrine was in full display. Now, most likely, we're not going to see the full economic barbarity until this, and believe me, it's inevitable, budget crisis and the market shocks kick in And that'll be probably after the first year, if he lasts that long. And believe you me, when the weather shocks come, those elites are going to be walled off, not just physically, but also psychologically. They're going to mentally detach themselves from the collective fate of the rest of humanity. Oh, how liberating for the elites. I mean, this defection from the human species, I mean, liberates them. I mean, not only to shrug off the urgent need for climate action, but they're also going to devise a way to be more predatory in ways to profit from that current and the future disasters and the instability that's going to follow. Thomas Paine, the writer Thomas Paine, said, "We have in our power to begin again." I think he said we have in our power to begin the world again. We have the power to change ourselves, to attempt to right the wrongs and to repair our relationships with one another and this planet that we share. And it's this work that's the bedrock of shock resistance. We can make the shock doctrine backfire. We can evolve and we can grow up in a crisis and set aside all kinds of bullshit, and fast. When we're faced with a shared trauma, communities can come together. We can have defiant acts of sanity and maturity for a change of pace. I mean, it's happened before, and the early signs are good that it's happening again. The Trump administration is coming after these huge sectors of the population at once. There's tens of millions of people who are being impacted by proposed budget crises, civil rights activists, artists, indigenous people, tribes, immigrants, even climate scientists, and that's just to name a few. And this rapid attack, though it's worked so often in the past, is actually really high risk. And the danger of starting fights on so many fronts is that if it doesn't succeed in demoralizing your opponents, well, it could very well unite them. Ponca Nation member Makasi Camp Hornak said this to a reporter on the day that Trump signed the permit approving the Keystone XL pipeline. He said, "I want to say thank you to the president for all the bad decisions that he's making, for the bad cabinet appointments that he's made, and for the awakening of the sleeping giant. People have never stood up for themselves. They have never had their voices heard, and that they have never put their bodies on the line. These people are now outraged. And I would like to say thank you to President Trump for his bigotry, his sexism, for bringing all of us in this nation together to stand up and unite." Thank you, sir. And so we have. So our huddle, our small but significant group, is united, along with the thousands of groups across the planet. We're connected by the visions we see in our hearts and in our minds. Our meetings are as much group therapy as they are political meetings. And we are changing the story of the nation. And for many, I mean, this is literally a first step in relearning how democracy works. When Harvard grads, a bunch of Harvard grad students announced an online and an in-person resistance school, there were literally over 50,000 people in all 50 states that signed up. We now have the 24-page Indivisible Guide, and now thousands of indivisible chapters have formed. I mean, we have school teachers, we have retirees, and most of these have never been an activist before, and it's not just a political community. It's a community that cares about you. What's bringing us together is this shared sense of civic responsibility toward this system that is totally going off the rails. And the trick is going to be to stick together and have each other's backs as never before. People are publicly pledging to take action to support one another, to be accountable to one another. They're acting in solidarity together, whether it's in the streets, whether it's in the halls of power, or in our communities, and they're doing it every single day. Because when they come for one, they come for us all. There is a reason to believe that many of these relationships that we are currently building in these early days are going to be strong enough to counter the fear that inevitably sets in during a state emergency. If Trump tries to use a crisis event to ram through his draconian measures, this resistance is prepared to rise up and act as a human barrier and say, no, not this time. But are we trapped in the matrix? Do we have the ability to envision a world radically different from the present? In the West, how many of us have any sort of memory of any other kind of economic system? There are some. We have the indigenous communities that have kept alive memories and models of other ways to live that aren't based on ownership of the land and the endless raping of the planet for profit. But most of us, outside of those traditions, are fully within the capitalism's matrix. So while we can demand all these little slight improvements here and there to our conditions, but imagine something else entirely different? Wow. So, what's too often missing is this clear and captivating vision of what's beyond no. Okay, so we've got white supremacy and misogyny that's been unleashed. The world is teetering on the edge of ecological collapse. The very last vestiges of the public sphere are set to be devoured by private capital. And we have this corrosive value system that places profits above the well-being of people and the planet. This is the same system that has allowed the pursuit of money to so corrode the political processes in the U.S. that a gang of scandal-plagued plutocrats could seize control of our White House. Rarely do these dots connect between the powerful man who think that they have the right to use and abuse women's bodies and this widespread notion that humans have the right to do the same thing to the earth. So many of the crises that we're facing are symptoms of the same underlying sickness. It's a dominance-based logic. And it treats so many people and the earth itself as disposable. So, the future, it can't simply be, where we were before Trump came along, AKA the world that gave us Trump. We need to do more than just draw a line in the sand and say no. We need to chart this credible and inspiring path toward a different future. It has to be, we have to be somewhere where we've never been before. So now the good news. In 2015, there was a group of Canada's top leaders that got together. They got together to map out the world that they didn't want. But it was a lot harder to create the world that they did want, that we do want. But what emerged is now known worldwide as the LEAP Manifesto. Only a vision that's pushing us forward on multiple fronts has this chance to win against Trump and all of his cohorts' agenda to push the world backwards. So this LEAP Manifesto is part of an international conversation. It's in the US, it's in the UK, it's in Australia, across Europe and beyond. People are arriving at the same conclusion, that it's time that we unite around this common agenda that can directly battle the political poison that's spreading throughout our countries. No is not enough. It's time for some bold yeses to rally around. So I strongly encourage all of the viewers to read the book, No is Not Enough by Naomi Klein, which is where the majority of my words just came from. Then go to the LEAP Manifesto online and learn the details. This project is sweeping the planet. Thanks for listening.